As you watch this video, take notes and answer these questions in your own words. Why does the Quran not tell us much about Muhammad? What is the Seerah? Who is Ibn Ishaq? What happened to Muhammad in Mecca? What happened on Mount Hira? Who are Khadija, Ali, and Abu Bakr? What happened to Muhammad in Yathrib? What is Medina? Why is the Seerah problematic as a source of information about Muhammad? For the last few discussions, we've made repeated mention of this man named Muhammad and his role as the messenger, the Rasul, who presented the Quran to the people of the late antique Hijaz. And so the question presents itself. Who was this Muhammad? What do we know about him? In a way that's rather surprising to people today, the earliest Muslims weren't as interested in Muhammad as later and modern Muslims are. They thought he was important, naturally, but he's nothing compared to the Quran that he presents, or, most especially, to the universal God who is sending this Quran through him. And that's kind of the point. If you look through the entire text of the Quran as we have it today, Muhammad is only named a small handful of times. 4 times by his proper name, and once by the nickname Ahmed. And that's it. The Quran talks to him quite a bit. It'll say, do this, or say this. But there are no detailed discussions of who Muhammad is, what he's like, or his biography in the Quran itself. Remember that when the Quran appeared in late antiquity, the most common religion of the Middle East was Christianity. There were large numbers of Jews, Zoroastrians, and Buddhists, with pockets of paganisms and other religions around, but Christianity was the official religion of 2 major empires, the Roman Byzantines and the Aksumite Ethiopians. And beyond even there, Christianity had spread all across the known world, from North Africa to the Chinese frontiers. And the Quran has some issues with one of the most standard claims of most Christians. That is, that Jesus is a divine being, that he's God's son, or even God himself. But the God of the Quran is one, and to associate a created being, like a person, with God is shirk, the Quran's most basic sinful act. Now, the Quran is absolutely clear that Jesus is a prophet and a messenger, and that he's uniquely the Messiah, the Christ. But it also insists that Jesus is not God or God's son. According to the Quran, you're not supposed to worship Jesus, you're supposed to follow his teachings. People of the book, don't exaggerate in your deen or say anything about God but the truth. The Christ, Jesus, son of Mary, was only a messenger of God and his word. So believe in God and his messengers. Surely God is only one God. He is far above needing to have a son. The Quranic God is utterly beyond humans in power. So why would such a reality need to have children? This, according to the Quran, is an act of shirk, confusing a sign of God, an ayah, in this case Jesus, with God himself. And as Quranic typology tends to work, what applies to past prophets applies to this new prophet Muhammad. Yes, like Jesus, Muhammad is very important. He comes bearing important news from God. But again, like Jesus, he's only a person. Don't dwell on him too much. And the Quran even commands Muhammad to talk this way, about himself. Say, I am only a human like you, to whom it is revealed that your God is one God. So whosoever hopes for the meeting with his Lord, let him do good deeds, and not associate anyone else in the worship of his Lord. And it seems that the earliest people that we could refer to as Muslims took warnings like this to heart. Muhammad's biography is not in the Quran. In fact, the first biographical books of Muhammad didn't appear until a minimum of 130 years after he died. And so, even the oldest detailed sources we have on Muhammad were written by people who never met him. It would be like if the first meaningful account of the American Civil War was just written yesterday. As you can probably expect, because the books about Muhammad and the man himself were so far removed from each other in time, when the first books did appear, people were seriously concerned about what was accurate information and what was a lie or a mere folktale or a confusion. And it's the same for modern historians looking for Muhammad. Nearly everything we know about him comes from a much later time, and so we can question the historical accuracy of more or less any detail of his life. This isn't as unusual as you would think. Most ancient people we only know about through much later historical records. Besides, it's usually not obvious who and what was important until you have a bit of historical hindsight. But in the case of a figure like Muhammad, who shaped the history of the entire world in his wake, this glaring gap is rather discouraging. Keep a note of that, because Islamic history is, in many ways, shaped by these debates of what exactly Muhammad said and did. So, what is the first book that gives us a biography of Muhammad? Around the year 760 or so, we find a text called the Siratul Rasulullah, the epic of God's messenger, usually just called the Sirah. A Sirah is something between a history, a biography, and a national legend. Usually in English, this word Sirah just goes untranslated, but the word Sirah might be closest to our notion of an epic, a story of a particular person that also tells the story of how a certain community came to be, and likewise says something about the human condition itself. That is to say, the Sirah is in many ways the story of a man named Muhammad. But it's also the story of his ummah, his community, the tribes of the Hijaz in late antiquity, and even wider still, how God interacts with humanity through prophets and sacred history. The Sirah was written by a man named Ibn Ishaq, who died in the year 761. Traditionally, Muhammad is said to have died in the year 632. So Ibn Ishaq and Muhammad lived about 130 years apart. That's important. How did this man, Ibn Ishaq, know about Muhammad since he never met him? We're told that Ibn Ishaq traveled around speaking to people about Muhammad and the Ummah, this community that had been founded a few generations earlier, and he collected what he heard. And often in the Sirah, Ibn Ishaq mentions that I heard this information from so-and-so. Eventually, after passing through several oral informants and written editors, this collected material was all gathered together into the Sirah as we have it today. But again, 130 years is an awfully long time for people to keep details precise. Information is bound to be forgotten, misunderstood, garbled, embellished, or even just made up. And Ibn Ishaq knows this. He even from time to time will give us multiple versions of the same story back to back, which shows us that he is not entirely clear which version is the correct one. And of course, maybe Ibn Ishaq was shaping the materials himself. Everyone has an agenda, even if you have the best of intentions. So all that is to say, we can't fully trust everything that we read about Muhammad in the Seerah. However, we shouldn't just dismiss it either. Sure, any given story or detail found in the Seerah can be questioned, but it seems unlikely that the general outline of Muhammad's life would be that different than what the Seerah says it is. And that's more or less how traditional Muslim scholars and historians today usually treat the Seerah. You can reasonably doubt almost any specific piece of information that it gives you, but the larger plot of Muhammad's life and times is probably reliable. If you were to read the Seerah of Ibn Ishaq, or other later sources on Muhammad, you would find a history roughly like this one. Ibn Ishaq gives a genealogy leading from the first human, Adam, through his descendants, to the founding of the village of Mecca by the tribal hero Qusay. Around the time of Muhammad's birth, a ruler in Himyar, modern Yemen at the southern tip of Arabia, whose name was Dhu Nuwas, had converted to Judaism, and he began to persecute the local Christians. Specifically, Dhu Nuwas massacred a community of Christians in the town of Najran. Across the Red Sea, the Aksumite Ethiopians, who themselves are Christians, decided to invade Arabia in the defense of Christians there, and, more realistically, to expand their imperial control in the region. The king of the Ethiopians sends a general named Abraha with an army and at least one war elephant to take Arabia from these Himyarites. But, as empires tend to do, they don't stop there. We're told that when Abraha and his army got to the village of Mecca, their war elephant refused to attack the city for some reason. Then, a flock of birds mysteriously attacked his army by pelting them with stones, which somehow spread some kind of plague. So, Mecca was apparently spared by divine intervention. This is the so-called Year of the Elephant, Am Afil, and this was the year which we're told that Muhammad was born in Mecca. On the Western calendar we use today, the Year of the Elephant is reckoned as the year 570. Before we move along, two things. First, we have a miracle, the supernatural defense of Mecca from destruction, which presumably kept the place safe for the birth of Muhammad. Since this is Islamic studies, we aren't making claims about God or the supernatural, so we are just going to leave miracle stories as we find them. We cannot affirm or deny their reality. All that we know is that Ibn Ishaq, the author of the Seerah, reports this event, and we can safely assume that he believes that it's historically accurate. Whether you believe it or not is not our business here, and the same is going to apply to other miracle stories that we'll meet. Second thing, we have a precise piece of historical information. Muhammad was born in the Year of the Elephant, which is reckoned as the year 570. This too we can easily question. There are some serious reasons to believe that Abraha's invasion of Arabia happened a decade or two earlier than our year 570. So is it possible that the Year of the Elephant was more like 560 or 550? Possibly. Is it possible that Muhammad is therefore older than we think? Again, possibly. Is it possible that Muhammad was indeed born around the year 570, but that he wasn't born in the Year of the Elephant? Well, that's possible too. And here again, like with miracle stories, we're not going to get bogged down with what really happened. just what people claim happened. Using Ibn Ishaq's math, most Muslims today would think that Muhammad was born in the year of the elephant, and that took place in the Western year 570. And like miracles again, we can ask the same sorts of questions to all the other historical data about Muhammad that we're about to encounter. Ibn Ishaq goes on to tell us about Muhammad and his family. He was a Meccan, and in his time Mecca would have been a very small village with little influence beyond the region. Mecca was home to a Kaaba, which was maintained by the tribe of Quraysh, Muhammad's tribe. But Muhammad was a marginal figure in the Quraysh. He was from a clan, the Banu Hashim, that had very little influence, and beyond that, Muhammad himself was an orphan. His father died before he was born, and his mother died when he was about 6 years old. And he had no siblings. Remember that in a tribal world, everything is about family connections. And in an extreme environment like Central Arabia's, where no one could survive on their own, an orphan could very easily be considered a dependent on the generosity and hospitality of other relatives. Fortunately, Muhammad did seem to have an extended family who cared about him. First, he was cared for by his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, and then, after Abdul Muttalib's death, Muhammad was cared for by his uncle, Abu Talib. But still, by all normal measures, Muhammad was a minor player from a minor town. He did seem to make something of a name for himself as a merchant, someone who knew the caravan routes well and was called the trustworthy one. One of his employers was a widow named Khadija. She was so impressed with his honest work that she even proposed marriage to him. Muhammad accepted this marriage, and together they had 4 daughters, as well as 2 sons who died in infancy. Around the age of 40, Muhammad began to make retreats with his family up to a mountain outside of Mecca called Hira. There, in a cave one night, the angel Jibril, came to Muhammad in his sleep with a piece of writing on cloth. Gabriel told Muhammad to recite what it said, to read it out loud. Muhammad was confused. It isn't clear from the seerah if he's confused because Muhammad couldn't read, or if it was just because he was scared of a strange encounter with an angel. Gabriel then squeezed and pressed Muhammad over and over again, repeatedly commanding him to recite. And then finally, Muhammad said the following words: "Recite in the name of your Lord who created the human of a blood clot. Recite, and your Lord is the generous, who taught by the pen, taught the human what he did not know." These were the first words of the Quran, which Muhammad, according to Ibn Ishaq, says were now written on his heart. This obscure man had been visited by an angel, and now he was the receptacle of a revelation. Encounters with Gabriel like this, as well as other supernatural experiences, would continue for the rest of Muhammad's life, often accompanied by ever more revealed verses of the Quran. Muhammad returned back down the mountain of Hira to his beloved wife Khadija and told her what happened. And she believed him. She told him that God would not abandon him. And this makes Khadija the first proper Muslim by our sense of the term, in that she was the first person to accept the reality of God, the truth of the Quran, and the prophecy of Muhammad. Eventually, Muhammad began to recite more and more of this recitation to his immediate family, the Quraysh. Within about 3 years, he had a small band of believers. Some of these were other marginalized people from the community, like Ali, the son of Abu Talib, Muhammad's cousin, who accepted the reality of the Quran when he was only 10 years old. Later, Ali would join Muhammad's house by marrying one of his daughters, Fatima, and since Muhammad had no adult male children, this made Ali Muhammad's de facto adopted son. Other early Muslims included more affluent figures like Abu Bakr, a wealthy friend of Muhammad who was renowned for his piety and honesty. Abu Bakr would use his influence and means to support Muhammad's prophetic mission, manumitting slaves and preaching to his friends. But not everyone in Muhammad's tribe was happy to call him a prophet. If God was one, and only one as this Quran suggested, then what does that mean about the ancestral gods and cults of Mecca and its Kaaba? Paganism was still strong in Mecca, and the Quraysh's deen included deities like Al-Uzha, a powerful fertility goddess, Manat, the goddess of fate, Alat, the goddess of warfare and craftwork, and Hubal, the god of health and fortune-telling. Why would Muhammad preach against the gods of Quraysh, his own people? And beyond that, there's also an economic risk behind Muhammad's teachings. Remember that Mecca is a small village of merchants and herders. Their only major source of outside revenue came each year during the pilgrimage to participate in the cult of the Kaaba's gods. But now, one of the Quraysh, one of the very people whose job it was to maintain the Kaaba's deen, was speaking out against its gods. So, although many people found the Quran compelling, both for its contents and its beauty, the tribal leaders of the Quraysh were not amused. Their way of life was under attack by one of their own. In fact, nearly all of Muhammad's enemies were his own uncles and aunts, people who knew him since he was a child. They began to harass him and those who believed in his message. They accused him of being just another poet possessed by a jinn. They said he was insane, or that he was a sorcerer. They mocked Muhammad for being so arrogant to think that he was a prophet. And surely if God wanted to speak to people, he would just send an angel, not some random merchant. And besides, everyone knew these stories that Muhammad was telling already. Why would the great and powerful God of the Jews and the Christians send a messenger just to bring them information that they already had? But Muhammad carried on, and even started to receive the attention of people outside of Mecca who wanted to see this new Arabian prophet and listen to his Quran. Some of these people who were curious about Muhammad were a delegation from the town of Yathrib, about 200 miles to the north of Mecca. Yathrib was somewhat larger than Mecca, an oasis town with a surrounding wall, and it was the home to several pagan and Jewish tribes who lived together. This delegation from Yathrib found Muhammad and his message compelling, and so they extended him an offer. In a tribal world without kings or fixed governments, intertribal disputes could be resolved by bringing in an outside arbitrator, someone who has no stake in a certain conflict. Well, many of the tribes in Yathrib had indeed been living in tension for various reasons, and so this delegation from Yathrib offered Muhammad a deal. If he wanted to escape the persecution that he was suffering by the Quraysh in Mecca, he could take refuge with them up in Yathrib, and in turn serve as their tribal arbitrator. Muhammad would consider the offer, but the persecution against his believers escalated. The Quraysh had tried to silence Muhammad and his disciples through a boycott. No one would be allowed to trade with Muhammad, his family, or his followers. In an extreme desert, you need trade to survive. No one can get enough food or water to support themselves. And so, a boycott is more than just a mere inconvenience. It's a threat. They're being starved out. Muhammad's own wife, Khadija, died during this boycott, and so did his uncle, Abu Talib. And many scholars guess that starvation might have played a role in their deaths. So Muhammad started to send some of his followers away from Mecca. First, he started to send some across the Red Sea into the Aksumite Ethiopian Empire. Their land was Christian, and as was their king, and so they were receptive to these persecuted monotheists. The rest of Muhammad's followers fled north up to Yathrib in small groups. And then finally, Muhammad himself, accompanied by Abu Bakr, left Mecca in the year 622 to join them and become the arbiter of the tribes of Yathrib. This event in the year 622 is known as the Hijra, the migration or the flight from danger. Remember that in the ancient world, especially in a tribal world, family is everything. You need other people to survive in a very practical way. But Muhammad's parents were long dead. His wife Khadija and his uncle Abu Talib were now dead too, and his extended family was literally trying to kill him. And so, breaking away from his tribe, an unimaginable risk in most circumstances, was the only option left. And so he and his followers decided to take that chance together. Upon his hijrah to Yathrib, Muhammad was now the arbiter of an interreligious, intertribal community, an ummah, a group that was less dependent on birth or deen, but was founded on allegiance to a common cause. The refugees, the Muhajirun of Mecca, and their helpers, the Ansar of Yathrib, this multi-tribal alliance of believers in the Quran and the Jews and pagans of Yathrib, would become an ummah together, a tribe bigger than any one tribe. But still, the problems of desert life remained. Resources were scarce even in the best of times. And now suddenly, the population of Yathrib was quite a bit larger. Plus, we have to suppose that many of the refugees from Mecca had to leave all their possessions behind. And so, the Ummah in Yathrib and the Quraysh in Mecca started to raid each other's caravans for food and the necessities of life. This wasn't uncommon. If you were in a life or death situation in the tribal world, you would either trade, and if you couldn't trade, you would raid. This new population boom in Yathrib of people who had nothing pushed the need to raid on the caravan route much further than it would normally go. So, the existence of this large ummah in Yathrib was a serious threat to the Meccan Quraysh, just as much as the Meccan Quraysh were a serious threat to the ummah. Up to this point, people who believed in the God of Muhammad's Quran were simply called believers. But now, these believers were living side by side with a large number of Jewish tribes in Yathrib. Perhaps because Jews also considered themselves believers in their own way, the people who specifically affirmed Muhammad's prophecy also slowly started to call themselves Muslims, submitters, people who submitted to the one God. This would not only include the refugees from Mecca, but some of the natives from Yathrib. The Muslims from Mecca, the refugees, and their helpers in Yathrib, both Muslims and Jews, together sensed the coming of a more serious war with their now common enemy in Mecca, the Quraysh. And so to survive, this ummah, this community, was going to have to transform Yathrib into a sanctuary for anyone who was allied with their cause, regardless of their tribal affiliation or their deen. After all, Yathrib wasn't just a town anymore. It was a city, a Medina, a shared living space where people from many families, tribes, and cultic groups lived and worked together for their mutual need to survive against common threats. When you hear the name Medina, think of it as something like a confederation, where lots of different people agree that they all have the same problems. In Medina, the Quran occasionally starts to mention that the Ummah has to fight for their survival against the Meccan Quraysh. But do not think of this as warfare of Muslims against non-Muslims. It wasn't, and it couldn't be. There weren't even that many people who were calling themselves Muslims yet. And besides, most of the people fighting on the side of Muhammad from Medina were probably Jewish, not Muslim. And on top of this, they were presumably Christians fighting on both sides. For instance, here is the first passage of the Quran in which the people of Medina are given the command to fight the Quraysh. It says that people who have been chased out of their homes are allowed to fight to take them back. And the refugees of Muhammad's Ummah are just such people. But look how it explains the point. Of course, you, the listener of the Quran, are allowed to fight, because God has allowed Jews and Christians to fight too. Permission has been given to those who fight, because evil has been done to them, and surely God is indeed able to help them. These are those who have been expelled from their homes without any right, only because they said, "Our Lord is God." But if God had not repelled some people by means of others, many monasteries, churches, synagogues, and prostration places, in which the name of God is mentioned often, would indeed have been destroyed. People are allowed to fight for their homes and the places where God is worshipped, and this seems to include Jews and Christians. This happened for Jews and Christians already in the past, and the Quran says it's happening for this alliance of Jews and Muslims in Medina at the present. And this fighting isn't ideal either. God doesn't seem to want people to kill each other, and they should try to avoid it. But let's be realistic. Sometimes violence is needed, even if it's not preferable. Remember that Muhammad and his Ummah were not professional fighters or an army. These were not people used to going into combat for political dominance. They were merchants, herders, leatherworkers, and spinners, not warriors. Then add on top of that, the Muslim refugees in Medina are themselves members of the Quraysh tribe. They, including Muhammad himself, are talking about fighting their own families. Muhammad, and for that matter the Quran, are not calling people to genocide. They are saying that sometimes you need to fight for your home and for your own well-being. And a number of battles did indeed occur. They were not very big battles, maybe at most a few thousand people fighting, maybe only a few hundred, but fighting did happen and people died on both sides, including several of Muhammad's own uncles who fought both for and against him. Eventually, Muhammad tried to find a non-violent solution. Meeting under a tree just outside of Mecca, Muhammad and some emissaries from the Quraysh signed the Treaty of Hudaybiyah around the year 628. There, they agreed to a 10-year-long peace. But the peace didn't last long. Two groups, one allied with the Ummah and the other with the Quraysh, had their own intertribal conflict going on, and they continued to fight each other. Because both sides' allies had now fought, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah was at least partially dissolved, and so it seemed violence would continue. The only thing stopping it were the upcoming sacred months. We're told that the tribes of Arabia traditionally would not fight during certain months of the year. So, it was clear to Muhammad that once these 4 sacred months were done, the Ummah would have to be ready for war. But that war never came, and Muhammad didn't annihilate his enemies when given the chance. On our date, January 11th, 630, Muhammad led his Ummah and their allies to take Mecca head-on. And the Quraysh surrendered, without a battle. Muhammad had in his hands his hometown that he had been chased out of years before, and now he had as captives most of the people who had persecuted him and killed many of his friends and family members. And so did he kill all these pagans and crown himself the king of Mecca? No. He declared an amnesty. All grievances, including his own, were to be abandoned. The only condition was that the Kaaba must be cleared out of pagan idols and rededicated to the one God alone, and that the Muslims must be free to make pilgrimage to Mecca as they liked. And then, Muhammad left Mecca alone. He returned back to Medina, and he remained there for the next 2 years, until he died of natural causes around the age of 62. It's not entirely clear what he died of, but it seems to have been either a stroke or an aneurysm. Again, we can question any number of these details for any number of reasons. But this general outline of Muhammad's life and times is agreed on by nearly everyone in both traditional Islamic sciences and modern Islamic studies. Even though both traditional and modern scholars of Islam will nitpick about the details of the seerah still forms the rough backbone of Muhammad's career for just about everybody. But, as we'll see next time, differences of opinion about Muhammad's exact biography would, in the years to come, lead to a whole world of trouble. Why doesn't the Quran tell us much about Muhammad? What is the seerah? Who is Ibn Ishaq? What happened to Muhammad in Mecca? What happened on Mount Hira? Who are Khadija, Ali, and Abu Bakr? What happened to Muhammad in Yathrib? What is Medina? Why is the seerah problematic as a source of information on Muhammad?